Australia First Party has taken up the slogan of independence and armed neutrality for Australia. These are subjects that have been around in Australian history for a very long time. The idea of an independent Australia, however, has always been treated as somewhat of a heresy by those people amongst our, shall we say, ruling circles. These people have never considered Australia in the full sense of the word, sometimes even to be a country, but certainly they've never considered the ramifications or the ideal of Australia being an independent country. Australian independence is something that's lurked below the surface of Australian politics from wide circles of Australians for more than 100 years. Initially, perhaps, it may have been conceived as simply independence from an old empire, but as the 20th century wore on, and particularly after the Second World War, it took on a whole new significance. Australian independence, as I said, is a heresy in Australian politics, and those who seek to go down the road of advocating Australian independence often end up on the receiving end from the state itself. Obviously today we see that Australia is suffering penetration by a new superpower, Red China. We see the clash between Australian trader class representatives over a former political alliance to the United States superpower, and how to balance that with a rising superpower with which they have economic interests. Various sections of that trader class fall out with each other over how to best arrange those circumstances. But generally speaking, it seems to come down this way, that they want all the benefits of trade, investment, cheap labour, open borders, open markets, the Asia future, which comes from a certain alignment with China, but at the same time they wish to remain loyal to what they call the Western Alliance, which is of course governed out of Washington, New York. This issue that sees sections of a trader class at war with each other sometimes over matters of advantage may well be a big issue in the winning of Australian independence. The Australian nationalists were, on this side of politics, if that's the right term for it, the first to advance the idea of Australian independence, and they did that in the 1970s. To give you a small anecdote, I was in the presence of a nationalist theorist, Mr. E.F. Asparty, in 1977 when he went for an interview with a, of all things, student newspaper. And during that discussion he referred to the existence of the three superpowers. The young woman who was the journalist said, "Don't you mean the two superpowers, the USA and the USSR?" And he said, "No, I mean the three superpowers." He said that there are three superpowers because Red China is too large, too powerful to be a middle-ranking country, but maybe not quite large enough as the intercontinental ballistic missile firing superpowers as the US and the USSR then was. He said, however, that China would become a fully fledged superpower probably within 30 or so years. It was pointed out in that interview that as we were in fact speaking, a major political change had taken place in China, and that this China change was being augmented from the system in Washington, New York. A massive amount of literature exists that shows conclusively that the rise of modern China has been facilitated by the secret government, the insider government, call it whatever you want in the US, groups such as the Council for Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, by the World Bank, by the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, by many institutions that run out of there. They facilitated at each stage its rise. If they now complain that China threatens them, and in one sense it certainly does, they are in fact the power which through trade and investment and technology transfer guaranteed its rise. So the nationalists were the first in Australia back then to speak of a Peking-Tokyo-Washington axis that had been created as the political significance of the US government's tilt towards China. That axis sought to restrict the old Soviet Union and as we all know from history, in 1991 the USSR fell. We were then in the situation of the three superpowers argument being changed. Today there are three superpowers. Two large ones, the US and Red China, and a third one, Russia, which is a superpower by virtue, if you like, of the weaponry and the systems and certain espionage and other factors that it inherited from the former Soviet Union. Today, these three superpowers vie with each other, two in particular for global dominance. In Australia today, we run the inordinate risk of warfare being conducted on Australian soil. There are many people out there, conservatives, so-called patriots and others, who consider that their alliance is the one that they made with the USA. In fact, they more or less believe in all the way with the USA. They consider that's correct. The USA protects them, they say, from all enemies. This is not true. It would be more likely that in a clash between those two great superpowers, that a deal could be done or struck over Australia by them to partition Australia, partition it geographically, partition it politically, partition it economically. Why not? If the price of the protection that this US superpower offers to Australia can only be met by nuclear incineration, then quite logically getting rid of Australia or dealing over Australia would be the proper thing for them to do. There is therefore no protection for Australia from that superpower. In this series of lectures that I intend to give, I'll explain further as to why it is that the US superpower does not protect Australia. But we find now that many people in our country, certain academics, other people involved in the study of strategy, have actually raised the question, could Australia be a neutral country? There are many people, of course, who've talked about neutrality. The Australian nationalists have talked about it for over 40 years. But there's neutrality and there's neutrality. Malcolm Fraser, a primary traitor to Australia, believed in a type of neutrality where our country tilted towards the third world, that it would treat everyone equally, he thought, be open for business with everybody, that Australia would go down the road of becoming a multiracial, multicultural, pseudo-democratic society, that it would deal with all shamelessly in peace, love and brotherhood. If that's armed neutrality, then it's not the model that we would suggest for Australia. In fact, from our point of view, armed neutrality can only be achieved by an independence movement, and an independence movement presupposes independence for what? Independence for whom? It's trite to talk about Australia as a geographic area with a pseudo-sovereignty, as some of the academics do. It's another thing to say that Australia should have independence and armed neutrality because Australia is a nation, and we have defined that nation. And that nation is defined as a European nation, but native to the soil with an identity all of its own. That type of independence and that type of armed neutrality are fundamentally different things. But the academics are quite right to raise all of the questions of how Australia could be not only independent, but neutral. A neutral country doesn't mean a country with no weaponry, quite the contrary. A neutral country means one that is prepared to not to surrender, but to defend its own borders, to defend itself by any and all means necessary. The vision splendid of an independent Australia, as I said at the start of this short talk, has been one that has existed in Australia for a long time. If we go back to the time of Federation, there were people who dreamt that dream. They considered that Australia could be a country alone, a country strong enough to protect and defend itself and have a destiny of its own. In 1911, a book appeared called The Australian Crisis. This book predicted that the British Empire would allow a large settlement of Japanese in the Northern Territory. Australia would object. The British would attempt to impose. The pro-British imperial government would fall. A national government would come into being and a civil war would exist between the imperial government and the national government, with the British to the side and the Japanese moving in. It was a fantasy story, most assuredly so, but it inspired the formation of our citizens' military forces and the foundation of our Australian Navy. If we come forward 100 years, we find there are those who are now talking about the detachment of the north of Australia into a northern zone, populated, if you like, by contract labour, a mining zone, a food bowl for Asia and so forth. And we are talking of increasing Chinese presence in the north of Australia. No wonder that the US superpower has installed itself in Darwin with a large military force. Again, the two superpowers balancing each other. But Australia's goal of having independence and armed neutrality does not mean that Australia can, if you like, pimp off parts of its territory or remove areas of its country from its own sovereignty. That is not the vision. To be independent and neutral means being armed. It also means having the will to assert the Australian identity. An independent and armed Australia would be one where there would be no US military bases here. There would be no US military forces here. But most assuredly, there would be no massive armies of Chinese contract labour or overseas students here. It would mean that Australia would seek a course of its own. To do that will be the subject of my next lecture. Thank you.